The Woodsman and Aengel tale. Most people think that when you chop down a tree, the product left behind is a perfectly level stump that clearly shows the rings of the felled beauty. This isn't the case, unless you happen to be using a large heavy-duty circular saw. For those of us that still stick to the archaic ways of manually chopping a tree down, the most advanced piece of equipment used is a chainsaw. The sounds of a fine-toothed blade rocking back and forth through a majestic red cedar echoed through the site as I struggled to cut away at a knot in the tree. I didn't have to cut all the way through, that would make the logging process much more complicated. I only had to cut a little more than half, then we could just let gravity do all the work. The relentless rocking and sawing of the chainsaw locked up my muscles, but there were still a few inches to go until the tree was ready to come down. The other workers had a 10,000-pound strap wrapped around the tree to control the fall when it came time to harvest the majestic gargantuan. I didn't always want to be a logger. I can remember faint pipe dreams of wanting to be an astronaut or a cowboy. The frigid village in northern Saskatchewan that I grew up in pretty much demanded the logging industry, much to my chagrin. Although, most of my coworkers would say that I'm the only one of them cut out for the job. They used words such as grizzly or brawny to describe me. They weren't too far off, I suppose. I've overheard some of them call me Paul Bunyan behind my back. It must have been because of my temperament. I wasn't very social with the other loggers. I just wanted to do my part, but all they ever wanted to do is stand around and gossip like middle-aged mothers. It isn't all bad. I've always enjoyed working with the trees. Being silent giants, we have a certain understanding. I know that they knew it wasn't personal that I dig into each of their guts with a razor-sharp axe or a puttering chainsaw. Still, I couldn't help but feel remorse every time I took one of them down. So, I gave back as much as I could. After the collapse of the mighty tree, I'd help the other loggers load the wood into a machine to be stripped of its bark and carried away. After, I'd leave a few acorns on the barren stump to find my way back after we've finished for the day. The others liked to make fun of me for this and say it's unnatural for a lumberjack to be such a tree hugger. Still, why shouldn't I give back to the earth that we are taking so much from? In school, we learned of the devastation that America and other top countries are reaping in South America. Our region's main export is wood, so you'd think my coworkers would understand that we can't be taking without giving back. It isn't sustainable. They just wanted to go home after the work is done. A large cracking sound overpowered the sound of the teeth ripping through the wood, which indicated that the tree was ready to be pulled down. It was the final tree of the day, so the others were anxious to load it up. Still, we had to be safe about it. There were too many people in the village that had been hurt in a logging accident. A bell rang around the campsite telling all the loggers to go home. We were finished for the day. The site was too large for the site manager to go around and dismiss everyone, so they had a large bell installed around 20 years ago. After the carrier trucks drove off, everyone grabbed their equipment and headed back to their cars. A few of the other loggers laughed as I turned around and walked further back into the site. Their ridicule didn't bother me. I was helping Mother Earth get back on her feet. One acorn at a time. Unfortunately, the site manager caught me as I was heading back into the forest. He didn't like it, because it meant I wouldn't punch out on time. He said, "You can't be doing more work on the company's time." He had caught me before, but I convinced him to let me go. The site manager let out a heavy sigh as he yelled to one of the other loggers that was not yet out of sight. "Can you clock him out when you get back?" He asked in a tone that suggested a statement more than a question. The other logger nodded, and the site manager urged me to continue, implying that he was going to see what I had been up to all these years. We walked back to the first cut of the day, and there were 5 acorns on a stump with a pickaxe propped up against the side of it. "What are you going to do?" the site manager asked. The question didn't need a response. I just picked up the pickaxe and started digging at the root of the tree. It was more laboring than using a chainsaw was, but it was the only good way to uproot a stump. I could see the shock in the site manager's eyes as I seemingly dug up the stump with no effort. He could see why the others had called me the simple giant behind my back. I took the acorns and spread them out in a pentagon shape, to give them all an equal chance of sprouting. "You do this every night?" With a humble nod, I moved to the next stump. The company typically took out more than 100 trees a day, but I only replanted the ones I was responsible for taking down. It would have been too much to try to replace all 100 every night, although I wanted to. The other loggers that knew I did. This called it unnecessary work, and would say that the acorns would produce trees if I just left them. Most people don't know that if the acorns aren't buried, they won't produce anything. Maybe it is unnecessary, but it makes me feel better. I buried the pickaxe under the stump of the remains of another cedar stump, digging around to find the weakest spots. The site manager leaned on one of the trees that was left for the company's sense of conservation. They felt that if they didn't cut all the trees down, they were doing the earth a service. How often do you do this on company time? Rarely, I muttered. I would have one of the other loggers punch me out, like the site manager had asked today. I knew they didn't understand, and I knew the site manager didn't understand. There was no reason for him to stop me, though. I wasn't breaking any rules. We continued to bury new acorns until the moon was glistening high in the sky. At the end of the night, I would drag the stumps back to my truck, and take them home for firewood. There only ended up being around 10, so this usually took an hour or two alone. The site manager graciously helped me this time, which cut down the time to an hour. What do you even do with these stumps? The stumps may have been useless as paper, or whatever other products trees make, but they were still useful as firewood. They burn easily, I stated as we threw another stump into the bed of the truck. I had to buy a net for the back of my truck, so they wouldn't fall out while I was driving on the highway. I still can't believe you've been doing this every night, the site manager laughed. He took out his lunch bag and gave me one of the beers he had been saving for later. I wasn't much of a beer drinker, but I'll admit that it was refreshing after all the work. I need to do this. He looked at me with a sense of confusion and curiosity. This is our home. We need to stop being parasites, I continued while looking up at the twinkling stars. The site manager didn't say anything. Perhaps he was astonished by me using the word parasites, as if he wouldn't have guessed that I knew what that was. Well, I think it's time for us to go. You're all done here, right? He asked, hoping there was no more work. I am. The site manager patted me on the back. I could tell that he felt some sort of newfound respect for me. It was none of my concern what he had felt for me. My only true duty was to the earth. Can I ask you something before I go? I get what you're trying to do here, but what is it all for? I jumped into my truck and turned the ignition. That, I replied as I pointed to the ground and started driving away. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the site manager scanning the dark floor to see what it was that I was pointing out. Contrasted against the brown of the topsoil stood a small, green sprout of a brand new red cedar. It wasn't just new life, it was hope. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, or subscribe if you liked the video.